So continuing with the introduction to credit risk that is there as a part of the FRM Part 1 curriculum, we'll now try to understand the concept of credit ratings and how they help in the evaluation of bonds. So a credit event could be a bankruptcy, a failure of the counterparty to pay, a cross default. So because you've defaulted on some other obligation, you will be considered to be in default on all obligations. A repudiation or a moratorium given on the payments, so for some years we are deferring the payments because the condition of the company is bad. A restructuring of the debt, downgrading by a credit agency, governmental action can all be construed as credit events or that cause a counterparty to repudiate or not honor its obligations. Now, generally speaking, if you're asked which of the following events is not a credit event, bankruptcy is, downgrading is, default on payments is, calling back a bond is not a credit event. It was an option that was present in the bond to begin with, which has been exercised. Now, credit ratings are assigned to bonds issued by corporates or even sovereigns, that is countries. Two big global rating agencies exist that rate bonds in various categories and manners. So the Standards and Poor's and the Moody's are the two globally recognized agencies. Now you must remember that in Standard and Poor's, AAA is the highest grade and BBB is the highest investment grade rating that the company gives. Anything below BBB, so BBB1, BBB2, etc., BBB3 will all be investment grade. BBB1, BBB2, BBB3, etc. become speculative grade. So BB and below would be speculative grade bonds according to Standards and Poor's. According to Moody's, again, AAA is the highest rating that it gives, and BAA is the highest investment grade rating given by Moody's. Below BAA, BA3, BA1, BA2 will all be speculative grade. The difference basically is in the credit quality. So investment grade bonds have a higher credit quality as compared to speculative grade bonds and higher risk of default. So it's not a linear progression, or these ratings are not on an interval scale. So generally investment grade is considered safe for investment, and a lot of institutions, banks, insurance companies have a restriction that their investments be made only in investment grade securities. As the rating goes down, normally the cost of debt and the interest rate that has to be offered will also go up. So remember, BBB is the highest in S&P and Moody's BAA is the highest investment grade rating. Now, how do these rating agencies rate issues? So the criteria to rate any particular company or any particular issue will evaluate not just the structure of the issue, that is, what is the seniority of the debt, is it subordinate to bank debt, etc. It will evaluate the financial ratios and the profitability and the sector outlook and the macroeconomic outlook of the country and the sector that the firm is operating in. So just for example, S&P gives a AAA rating to capitals or to corporates whose total debt to capital, that is debt upon debt plus equity, is less than 12%. So there's hardly any debt. The EBITDA to interest is 26 times. So earnings before interest, tax, depreciation that is available to pay your interest is 25 times the interest amount. The EBIT to interest similarly is a very high number. You don't have to remember these numbers, but just know that it is the credit quality, the financial ratios, the profitability, the outlook, the macroeconomic outlook, and all these scenarios that the ratings agencies assess, and then they give a AAA rating, BB, CCC rating. So if the company is highly levered, that is debt to capital is 114%, then the rating would be very bad. It will be a triple C rating. EBITDA is not even able to cover the interest payment. EBITDA to interest is only 0.9. EBIT is also much lower than the interest outgoes or the interest payments. Now we'll study more about ratings and how these ratings can transition from one level to another level, and how do those probabilities affect our analysis. However, we'll just do a few questions to understand the rating agencies and the ratings they give. So what is the lowest tier of an investment grade rating given by Moody's? The lowest tier is BAA by Moody's, and remember BAA1 is higher than BAA3, so the lowest grade will be BAA3. You are considering an investment in one of three different bonds. Your investment guidelines require that any bond you invest in carry an investment grade rating from at least two recognized bond rating agencies. Which, if any, of the bonds listed below would meet your investment guidelines? Bond A carries an S&P rating of BB and a Moody's rating of BAA. Bond B carries an S&P rating of BBB and Moody's rating of BA. So this will also not work. This will also not work because it's speculative grade. This is speculative grade. Bond C carries S&P of BBB and Moody's of BAA. So this has investment grade rating by two recognized agencies. If Moody's and S&P are equally good at rating bonds, the average default rate on BB bonds by S&P will be lower than the average default rate on bonds rated by Moody's as. So if both are equally good, then BB rated bonds of S&P will be better than which bond? That is, the default rate would be lower than which Moody's bonds? So we just have to pick the lowest of the Moody's. It will be better than the lowest of the Moody's ratings. The lowest Moody rating that we can see here is BA3. So BB should definitely be better than the worst rating here, and the worst rating here that we see is BA3. The credit rating agencies then give us cumulative default probability tables. So for instance, this is the Moody's cumulative default probability table. That is, if a bond is BAA, then there is a 0.34% chance that it will default in the next 1 year. There is a 1% chance that it would have defaulted by the next 2 years. There is a 7% chance that would have defaulted by the 9th year. That is, in the next 9 years, sometime it will default. Similarly, for a AAA bond, there is a 2% chance that it will default in the next 20 years. For a speculative grade bond, there is a 40% chance that it would have defaulted or it will default in the next 20 years. These are cumulative probabilities, probabilities of default next year, within 2 years, so on and so forth. Now, the cumulative default probability can be calculated from the marginal default rate. So the marginal default rate is the probability that you will default in the coming year. So if D1 is the probability of default in year 1, that means 1 minus D1 is the probability of no default in year 1 or period 1. D2 is the probability of default in period 2. 1 minus D2 is the probability of no default. So on and so forth, we can build the whole tree. So what is the cumulative probability of default in year 1? It will simply be D1, or D1 is the chance that the bond will default in year 1 itself. What is the cumulative probability of default till year 2? That is, either it defaults in year 1, chance of which is D1, or it defaults in year 2, chance of which is 1 minus D1 that it doesn't default in year 1, and then D2 chance that it defaults in year 2. So D1 plus 1 minus D1 into D2 will be the cumulative probability of default by year 2. Similarly, the probability that it would have defaulted by the third year would be D1 in the first year, 1 minus D1 into D2 in the second year, or if it doesn't default in any of these years, the probability of which will be 1 minus D1 into 1 minus D2 into D3 would be the cumulative probability of default by the third year. This can also be calculated by computing 1 minus the probability of no default. So what is the probability that no default happens in any of these years? 1 minus D1 into 1 minus D2 into 1 minus D3, in the first also, in the second, or in the third. 1 minus this probability will be the probability that the bond defaults in at least one of the years or at some point in time. So you can verify this formula will come out to be the same. Consider a B-rated firm that has default probabilities of 5% in the first year and 7% in the second year. Compute the cumulative default probabilities in the 2 years. So the probability that will default in year 1 will be given as 5%. Probability that it will default in year 2 itself is given to be 7%. So the cumulative probability till year 2 will be given as 5% plus 1 minus 5%, that is 0.95. First, that it does not default in the first year, and then it defaults in the second year. This could also have been calculated as 1 minus the probability of no default, that is 1 minus 0.95 into 0.93, both will come out to be 11.65%. Company ABC was incorporated on January 1, 2004. It has an expected annual default rate of 10%. Assuming a constant quarterly default rate, what is the probability that company ABC will not have defaulted by April 1, 2004? So the annual default rate is 10%. So probability of default in 1 year is 10%. Let's assume that the quarterly default probability is given as Q. If the quarterly default probability is given as Q, then what is the probability that the firm would not have defaulted by the end of the year? So no default in the first quarter, no default in the second, no default in the third, and no default in the fourth. So 1 minus Q to the power 4 is the probability of no default in any of the years. 1 minus Q to the power 4 is the probability that the firm would have defaulted in any 1 year, or at least some default would have happened. 1 minus Q to the power 4 is the probability of no default. 1 minus this will be the probability of some default sometime. This is given to be how much? 10%. 10% is the probability of some default. So can we derive Q? 1 minus Q to the power 4 will be 0.9, or Q would be equal to 0.9 to the power 1 by 4, or rather 1 minus Q will be equal to this number, or Q will be equal to 1 minus 0.9 to the power 0.25, which comes out to be so let's first do 0.9 y to the power x 0.25, which comes out to be 0.974. 1 minus this will be minus 1, which comes out to be 2.6%. So the Q comes out to be 2.6% or 0.026. So there's a 2.6% chance of default in the first quarter. So what is the probability of no default at the end of the first quarter? It will be 100 minus 2.6, that is 97.4%. Please do not be in a hurry and tick 97.5%. The choices are quite close. That will be the wrong answer. A company has a constant 7% per year probability of default. What is the probability that the company will be in default after 3 years? So there's a 7% chance of default. So 7% chance that the company will be default in 1 year. 7% that it will default, and again 7%. So what is the probability that the company will be in default? 1 minus the probability of no default. So 1 minus 0.93 to the power 3. No default in the first, no default in the second, no default in the third year. Please verify this comes out to be 19.6%. According to Standard & Poor's, the 5-year cumulative probability of default for BB rated debt is 15%. So the chance that in the next 5 years the cumulative probability of default is 15%, or 75% chance of, rather 85% chance of no default. The marginal probability of default from year 5 to year 6 is 10%, conditional on no prior default. So if there's no default up till now, then 10% chance that he'll default in the 6th year. What is the 6-year cumulative probability of default? 15% that he defaults in the first 5 itself, plus 0.85 that he doesn't default in the 6th, or rather doesn't default in the first 5, and then 10% chance that he defaults in the 6th year. Which will come out to be 23.5%. Let's do one last question. A corporate bond will mature in 3 years. The marginal probability of default in year 1 is 3%, in year 2 is 4%, and in year 3 is 6%. What is the cumulative probability that default will occur in the 3-year period? Again, we'll calculate it as 1 minus the probability of no default. That will be 0.97 into 0.96 into 0.94, which comes out to be 12.47%. What is the difference between marginal default probability and the cumulative default probability? Marginal default probability is the probability that the borrower will default in any given year, whereas cumulative default probability is over a specified multi-year period. This is correct. Marginal probability of default is due to a particular credit event, whereas cumulative is for all credit events is incorrect. Marginal probability is the minimum probability that the borrower will default, whereas cumulative is the maximum. This is also incorrect. Option A is correct. Now, a very important concept is that of the transition probabilities. So all credit rating agencies from the analysis of historical ratings can also derive transition probabilities. For example, there's a 97% chance that an A-rated debt will continue to remain an A-rated debt at the end of the year. There's a 3% chance that at the end of the year A-rated will become B-rated, and no chance that it will go in default or it will become C-rated. A B-rated, 2% chance that it will improve to A, 93% chance that it will remain in B, 2% chance that it will go to C, and a 3% chance that it will default in the next year. Given this transition probability table, compute the 2-year probability of default or cumulative 2-year probability of default for a B-rated issue. So for a B-rated issue, either it can default in year 1 itself, the chance of which is 3%, or it can not default in year 1 and default in year 2. That is, after year 1, it can become an A-rated bond or a B-rated bond or a C-rated bond and then default. These are the only two ways that it can default. Either it defaults directly, that we have already accounted for, or it becomes A, B, C and then defaults. So 2% of the times it will become an A-rated bond. If it does, then there is no chance of default. 93% of the times it will remain a B-rated bond, in which case there is a 3% chance of default. 2% of the times it will become a C-rated bond, in which case there is a 23% chance of default in the second year. So over a 2-year period, this summation will give us the cumulative default probability that will come out to be 3% plus 3.25%, that is 6.25%. Similarly, the question could have asked that what is the probability that the bond will default in year 3? So from year 1, it can default in year 1, 3%. It can default in year 2. Cumulative probability of all this is 3.25. There could be more paths to default in year 3. That is, from an A-rated, it can further become A, B or C and then default. From a B-rated, it can further become A, B and C and then default. From a C-rated, it can become A, B and C and then default. If it is already in default, then it can go nowhere because it was already defaulted. So various paths to default include defaulting in year 1, defaulting in year 2, B to A to D, B to B to D and B to C to D. And it can default in year 3, that is, from B become A, then remain at A and then again default, chance of which is 0. B, A, B, D, B, B, C, D. So all possible paths to default we will have to consider and compute the probability of each. We'll sum it all up and this will be the probability of defaulting in year 3, which comes out to be 3.33%. So the probability that it will default in 3 years will come out to be 9.58%. For any one path we can calculate, let's say from B it becomes C, then remains at C and then becomes D. So probability from becoming B to C is given to be 2%. Then probability from C remaining at C is 64% and C defaulting is 23%. So it will be 0.02 into 0.23 rather into 0.64 into 0.23, or B, C, C, D will be 0.02 into 0.64 into 0.23, that is 0.29% chance that it becomes C, remains at C and then defaults. So for all such paths, we will sum it up and compute the probability of default in year 3. Sum it up all and you'll get the cumulative probability of default in the next 3 years. The transition matrix in credit risk measurement generally represents the probability of migrating from one rating to another over the loan lifetime. Correlations amongst the various ratings, correlations of market movements impacting rating, or the probability of migrating from one to another within 1 year. The probability of migrating from one rating to another within 1 year. Given the following transition matrix, calculate the 2-year cumulative probability of default for a B credit. So the exact same question. So from B, it can default directly, chance of which is 2%. Then again from B, it can become A and then default. Probability of B becoming A is 0.03 and A defaulting is 0. It can remain at B and then default in the second year. So probability of B remaining at B is 90% and then B defaulting is 2%. B can become C and then C can default. Probability of B becoming C is 5% and C defaulting is 14%. So 0.02 plus all these probabilities, that is 0.18 or 1.8%, will give us the cumulative probability of default, which comes out to be 4.5%. Now in the case of a bankruptcy, generally the secured creditors who are secured with the collateral will get paid first, then will be the priority creditors. So these will be banks. Banks will generally give a secured loan. Then priority creditors, that is firms that lend money during the bankruptcy period. Providers of goods and services during the bankruptcy period get paid next. Taxes get paid before the general creditors get any money. That is unsecured creditors before the bankruptcy, and if money is left, will go to the shareholders. Recovery rates will be high if the seniority of the debt is high, if the general status of the economy is good, if the obliger's characteristics are good, that is, he has tangible assets, factories, land, which can be sold and money recovered. If it's a service company which has no assets, it's just people who have quit, then recovery rates will be lower, or the amount you will get back is lower. So recovery rate is what fraction of your outstanding loan do you get back. If it's 40%, that means default happened, but 40% of the money we recovered. You also have to look at the type of default. So if it's a bankruptcy, recovery will be lower. If it's just a restructuring or it's a moratorium or something like that, then default will be, or the recovery will be higher. So the Moody's mean recovery rates for various countries are also given. You can go through them, you do not need to remember. The recovery rate on credit instruments is defined as 1 minus the loss given default. The loss rate can be significantly influenced by the volatility of the value of a firm's assets before default. All other things being equal, in the event of a default, which type of company would we expect to have the highest recovery rate? A trading company, an internet merchant, an asset incentive manufacturing company, or a highly leveraged hedge fund? The manufacturing company will have the highest recovery rate because of tangible assets. So that's about the review on credit ratings and credit transition matrices. That is a part of FRM part 1 after the introduction to credit risk. So focus on the numericals on the credit transition matrix. They may be asked so that you should be able to solve the questions.